President Faust of Harvard, wrote a remarkable book about the Civil War, and what she concentrates on is the human consequences of the Civil War, the dead, the wounded. I mean, you know, that was a war in which enormous number of amputations took place without anesthetic, you know. I mean, so it's not just the 600,000 dead, it was all of those who came home without a leg or an arm. I'm trying to make the cost of the war more than a statistic, because we have gotten used to just dealing with statistics, and the statistics are dead. The statistics are, you know, become meaningless. They're just numbers. 600,000. Just read it and go quickly past it. But no, I don't want to go past the cost of these wars. I want to consider them very, very seriously and rack it up and don't forget about it, even as you consider the benefit of the war, the freedom of the slaves. But you also have to think the slaves were freed. And what happened after that? Were they really freed? Well, they were, actually. There was no more slavery. But the slaves who had been given promises, you know, 40 acres and a mule, they were promised, you know, a little land and some wherewithal so they could be independent, so they needn't be slaves anymore. Well, they weren't given anything. They were left without resources, and the result was they were still in the thrall, still under the control of the plantation owner. They were free, but they were not free. There have been a number of studies made of that, you know, in the last decade. They're free, but not free. They were not slaves now, they were serfs. They were like serfs on a feudal estate. They were tenant farmers, they were sharecroppers. They couldn't go anywhere. They didn't have control of their lives. And they were in the thrall of the white plantation owners, the same white plantation owners who had been their masters when they were slaves, were now their masters when they were serfs. Okay, I don't want to miss in the old sense. No, it's not. It's better. It's a better situation. So I want to be cautious about what I say about that, and I want to be clear. But I want to say it's more complicated than simply, oh, the slaves were freed. They were promises made to them were betrayed, as promises made during wartime are always betrayed. The veterans are betrayed, the civilians are betrayed. The people who expected war to produce great results in freedom and liberty, they are betrayed after every war. So I just want us, you know, to consider that and to ask the question, which is a very difficult question to answer, but it's worth asking. We might have ended without 600,000 dead, without a nation of amputees and blinded people. Is it possible? Because after all, we do want to end slavery. It's not that we're saying, well, we shouldn't have a bloody war because just let people remain slaves. No, we want to end slavery. But is it possible to end slavery without a bloody civil war? After all, when the war started, it wasn't Lincoln's intention to free the slaves. You know that. That was not his purpose in fighting the war. His purpose in fighting the war was to keep Southern territory within the grasp of the central government. You could almost say it was an imperial aim. It was a terrible thing to say, I know. But yeah, that's what the war was fought for. It's put in a nice way. We fought for the Union. We fought, you know, we don't want anybody to secede. Yeah, why not? What if they want to secede? We're not going to let them secede. No, we want all that territory. No, Lincoln's objective was not to free the slaves. The Emancipation Proclamation came, and by the way, it didn't free slaves where they were enslaved. It freed the slaves that the national government was not able to free. It declared free the slaves who were in the states, in the Confederate states that were still fighting against the Union. In other words, it declared free the slaves that we couldn't free. And it left as slaves the slaves that were in the states that were fighting with the Union. In other words, if you were a state that was a slave state, but you were fighting on the side of the Union, we'll let you keep your slaves. That was the Emancipation Proclamation. I never learned that when I learned it. I said, oh, the Emancipation Proclamation, great. But then, slavery was, and yes, Congress passed the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments. 13th Amendment ends slavery. The 14th Amendment declares equal rights. Can't deny people equal protection of the law. 15th Amendment, you can't prevent people from voting because of their color, their race. No. However, these promises of equality in the 14th and 15th Amendment, the promise, the right to vote, they were honored for a few years when there were federal troops in the South to enforce them, and then they were set aside. And black people in the South were left at the mercy of the white plantation owners. So there was a great betrayal that took place, a betrayal that lasted 100 years. Those 100 years of segregation and of lynching and of the national government looking the other way as the Constitution was violated 1,000 times by the white power structure in the South. And, it took 100. And, Congress passed those amendments. Why? Not because Lincoln or Congress itself initiated them. They passed those amendments because a great movement against slavery had grown up in the country from the 1830s to the 1860s. Powerful anti-slavery movement which pushed Congress into the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Very important thing to keep in mind that when justice comes and when injustices are remedied, they're not remedied by the initiative of the national government or the politicians. They only respond to the power of social movements. And that's what happened with the relationship between the anti-slavery movement and the passage of those amendments. And of course then those amendments, the 14th and 15th Amendments, had no meaning for the next 100 years. The blacks were not allowed to vote in the South. Blacks did not get an equal protection of the laws. Every president of the United States for 100 years, every president, Democrat or Republican, liberal or conservative, every president violated his oath of office. Every president, because the oath of office says you will see to it that the laws are faithfully executed. Every president did not enforce the 14th and 15th Amendments, collaborated with Southern racism and segregation and lynching and all that happened. So the Civil War and this aftermath, have to be looked at in a longer perspective. And yes, the question needs to be asked also, is it possible that slavery could have been ended without 600,000 dead? We don't know for sure. I mean, when I mention these possibilities, it's very hard to imagine how it might have ended, except that we do know that slavery was ended in every other country in the Western Hemisphere. Slavery was ended in all these other places in the Western Hemisphere without a bloody civil war. Well, that doesn't prove that it could have been ended in, every situation is different, but it makes you think. If you begin to think, the only way it could have been done is with a bloody civil war, maybe not. Or maybe it would have taken longer. Maybe there could have been slave rebellions which hammered away Southern slave structure, hammered away at them in a war of attrition, not a big bloody mass war, but a war of attrition and guerrilla warfare and John Brown type raids. Remember John Brown, who wanted to organize raids and slave rebellions? Little guerrilla actions. Not totally peaceful, no, but not massive slaughter. Well, John Brown was executed by the state of Virginia and the national government. He was executed in 1859 for wanting to lead slave revolts. And the next year, the government goes to war, in a war that cost 600,000 lives, and that presumably, as people came to believe, to end slavery. There's a kind of tragic irony in that juxtaposition of facts. So it's worth thinking about the Civil War, and not to simply say, well, Civil War ended slavery, therefore whatever the human cost was, it was worth it. It's worth rethinking. Now we come to World War II. Looking at my watch. I don't mean it.
You're on a roll tonight. You're good.
No, I don't mean it. Well, World War II, the good war, the best. Fascism. I mean, that's why I enlisted in the Air Force. Fight against fascism. It's a good war. It's a just war. What could be, more obvious? They are evil. We are good. And so I became a bombardier in the Air Force. I dropped bombs on Germany, on Hungary, on Czechoslovakia. Even weeks before the war was to end, when everybody knew the war was to end, and we didn't need to drop any more bombs, but we dropped bombs on a little town in France. We were trying out napalm. The first use of napalm in the European theater. I think by now you all know it. Napalm is one of the ugliest little weapons, but trying it out and adding metals, and who knows what reason, what complex of reasons led us to bomb a little town in France. When everybody knew the war was ending, and yes, there were German soldiers there hanging around. They weren't doing anything, weren't bothering anybody, but they're there, and gives us a good excuse to bomb. Now, we'll kill the Germans. We'll kill some Frenchmen, too. What does it matter? It's a good war. We're the good guys. One thing, and I didn't think about any of this while I was bombing. I didn't examine, who are we bombing and why are we bombing and what's going on here? And who is dying? I didn't know who was dying, because when you bomb from 30,000 feet, well, this is modern warfare. You do things at a distance. It's very impersonal. You just press a button, and somebody dies. You don't see them. So I dropped bombs from 30,000 feet. I didn't see any human beings. I didn't see what's happening below. I didn't hear children screaming. I didn't see arms being ripped off people. No. Just drop bombs. You see little flashes of light down below as the bombs hit. That's it. And you don't think. It's hard to think when you're in the military. Really, it's hard to sit back and examine ask what you're doing. No, you've been trained to do a job, and you do your job. So I didn't think about any of this until after the war, when I began to think about that raid on France. And then I began to think about the raid on Dresden, where 100,000 people were killed in one day of bombing. Read Kurt Vonnegut's book, Slaughterhouse-Five. He was there. He was a prisoner of war. And there in the basement, in a kind of meat locker, slaughterhouse. And then I became aware of the other bombings that had taken place. But when you're in a war, you don't see the big picture, and you really don't. I didn't know until afterward. 600,000 German civilians were killed by our bombing. They weren't Nazis. Well, yeah, you might say they were passive supporters in that they didn't rebel. Well, a few rebelled, but how many Americans rebel against American war?